Hi, my name's Shannon Bontrager, and I'm doing a book review of a book that I've just recently finished, Empire of the Senses: Bodily Encounters in Imperial India and in the Philippines by the historian Andrew J. Rotter. This beautiful book cover by Oxford University Press artists has lovely lines and uses two photographs. The first one on the top here is a photograph of Americans using a gramophone speaking to, or the gramophone is speaking to, an audience of Filipino people with the idea that sound can colonize the Filipinos. And then this bottom photograph is of British people on elephants being guided by local people in India. And the two photographs together make a lovely sort of description of the thesis and the theme of the book. That two empires, two Anglophone empires, the American and the British Empire, are doing the work of colonizing other people through the senses. And Rotter even suggests that these empires are learning from each other as their empires unfold. I really like the color here, this sort of mustard green color. Here is the spine of the book. Then we have the back of the book with some lovely blurbs from very well-esteemed historians, Mark Smith, Lizzie Collingham, and Christopher Cabazzola are all leading scholars in sensory and imperial and U.S. history. If you like the review, please subscribe to my channel, like it, post a comment. I'm happy to respond. But without further ado, here's the review of Empire of the Senses: Bodily Encounters in Imperial India and the Philippines. The five senses help us navigate nature, but, according to historian Andrew J. Rotter, they can also help us construct an empire. Rotter is the Charles A. Dana Professor of History and Peace and Conflict Studies at Colgate University. His book, Empire of the Senses: Bodily Encounters in India and the Philippines, uses sensory history to compare the British and American empires side by side. Oxford University Press published the book in 2019, and they did a lovely job in producing a sensory experience for the reader. High quality alkaline paper and a dust cover with an attractive but calming mustard green hue, with two evocative images that would make for fine memes of the book in social media. Much work goes into designing covers, and OUP artists did well to create a book with colors and lines that speak to organization and innovation. Organization and innovation is what describes the structure of the content as well. Rotter was inspired by sensory historian Mark Smith, who has done much to take the ideas of French historians Alain Corbin and apply them to the American context. Corbin's examination of perfume and bells in 19th century France laid the groundwork for a whole generation of sensory historians, and Smith's recent The Smell of Battle and the Taste of Siege is a sensory history of the Civil War that places him in this genre. Recently, sonic history and oral studies, including deaf studies, have attempted to accentuate the ear's role in a historical genre that, at least since the Enlightenment, has tended to privilege the visual power of the eye. Recovering the history of the other non-visual senses is sometimes posed as a critique of Enlightenment histories. Histories that privilege the senses, that do not rely on the eye, are often very difficult to write because primary sources such as newspaper accounts or journal writers do not often take the time to fill their accounts with such descriptions of sound and smell, etc. But doing the hard work of finding sources with sensory information is important to history. Not only does it allow us to recover histories that Enlightenment historians have neglected in their obsessed pursuit of the visual, but humans interpret the environment through the five senses. All five are necessary to make sense of the world, and as new discoveries in how human memory works suggests, our minds use these five senses interdependently to understand social constructions of reality and to make memories. Andrew Rotter takes advantage of how our senses work with our minds to explain how British and Americans colonized faraway lands in India and the Philippines. He divides his book into chapters that focuses on each sense: seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. I was drawn to this book for the chapter on smell and odor. I came across this book at the American Historical Association's annual conference in New York in January 2020 and picked it up at the OUP booth because I was writing an article on how Americans chemically sanitized the recovered bodies of dead soldiers who fought in Cuba because they smelled so bad. Rotter organizes his book around the senses and has to sacrifice chronology to do so. It could be a difficult comparison to make, for as much as Britain and America are culturally and politically similar, their imperial visions are profoundly dissimilar. The British Empire, for example, recognized difference in colonial subjects and often governed as if certain rules that applied to people in India did not apply to the British because of this difference. Americans governed the Philippines with the design of making Filipinos into Americans. Rules tended to be applied evenly to everyone, at least theoretically, in the American Empire. A seasoned historian, Rotter more than understands this dichotomy, and each chapter actually works well within this contrast. British and Americans govern colonized subjects differently, even as imperial agents apply similar methods to subdue large populations. What gives senses life is Rotter's reliance on Edward Said's concept of Orientalism. The idea that Said presented in his infamous work on the relationship between the Orient, that is the East, and the Occident, or the West, is that Westerners often defined people who lived in non-Western places through history, art, and literature. This, Said contends, is a powerful way to build and perpetuate racial stereotypes through cultural reproduction. Other historians, such as Paul Kramer, have picked up on this idea. Kramer argues in The Blood of Government that Americans, not people who lived in the Philippines, created the idea of being Filipino through their governing by racial stereotypes. Rotter argues that this kind of Orientalism was created through British and Americans trying to regulate, control, and even reinvent the senses of Indian and Filipino people. The book is filled with all kinds of extraordinary stories of Westerners going to India or the Philippines and being absolutely aghast at the sensory attack on their own Western values. Colonized people needed to be colonized, argued imperialists, because they had no understanding of how Enlightenment senses were supposed to be used. The trick for civilizing barbarians, they argued, was civilizing the barbarian senses. Here's Rotter's second major theoretical influence, Norbert Elias's The Civilizing Project. Elias examines Western European cultural practices, seemingly as trivial as blowing noses and using eating utensils, to suggest that nation states emerged out of the Middle Ages at moments when elite culture, manners, and quote-unquote civilized behavior began to permeate society. As civilized culture took root, nations broke from the medieval norms. Although Eurocentric and dated, Rotter uses Elias's notion of the civilizing process not to describe how the British or Americans tried to give birth to new nations in India and the Philippines. No, he uses Elias to describe Westerners' attempts at colonization. Rotter's coupling of Elias with Said may seem strange at first, but it pays dividends again and again in each chapter. Whether using the sense of sight to condemn the diseased or the over-sexualized, taste to distinguish colonial food from healthy food, smell to sense the location of disease and poor hygiene, hearing to control political speech, or touch to control the sexuality of the colonized, British and American colonizers built their empires through what they sensed in India and in the Philippines. This was not a one-way process, however. Colonists struck back against their imperial senses. Though many British had misgivings about curry, for example, Indian people changed the tastes of the colonial overseer, seducing their colonizers through their food. Colonizers and colonized mixed sexually too. Many Brits and Americans brought Indian or Filipino food and customs home with them and incorporated them into American society as time went on. Sometimes the very senses that Westerners produced became objects of resistance or even protest. Mutiny in the Sepoy Rebellion being just the most obvious example in India. Rotter showcases well how colonizers often became colonized by the very senses that the colonizers were trying to colonize. Rotter did not show the inter-imperial exchange and learning as well as I would have liked. While it appears that imperialists looked at each other from afar, it remains unclear how intimate and how much British and Americans directly learned from each other. How do imperial agents share information with each other, and how do empires learn from other empires are questions that remain for further research. Rotter likewise alludes to the idea that imperial agents learned how to implement their empire of the senses in part from their experiences on the domestic front, while they grew up in the core of the empire. Interpreting the senses in a colonial system thus is shaped not only by experiences in the frontier, but also by past experiences in the core. If domestic and frontier landscapes are linked in imperial practices, then an imperial memory of home must exist. While Rotter focuses solely on bodily encounters, how senses stimulate psychic memories to become imperialistic is an avenue for research that could be further explored by others. Finally, Rotter's focus on the Anglophone world is insightful and important, and hopefully it will inspire other similar comparisons in the Francophone world or Francophone-Anglophone comparison, or in other imperialistic comparative studies. Overall, Empire of the Senses provides a fascinating comparative exploration of how the senses work within two imperialistic regimes. It is a worthwhile read for historians, graduate students, and the general public interested in sensory history, food, disease, or empire building in the Anglophone world. Inside the book, we have the table of contents. So, the acknowledgments, an introduction, and 7 chapters with a conclusion. The introduction is titled Embodied Empires. Chapter 1, The Senses and Civilization. Chapter 2, Fighting, War, and Empires on Set. Chapter 3, Governing, Subjects, and the States Envisioned. Chapter 4, Educating, New Soundscapes. Chapter 5, Sanitizing, the Campaign Against Odor. Chapter 6, Touching, Feeling, and Healing, Hapticity, and the Hazards of Contact. Chapter 7, Nourishing Imperial Foodways, and the conclusion, The Senses at Empire's End. There are 288 pages of text, and the notes comprise another from page 289 to page 334, the notes. To do the research of this book, Rotter has gone and consulted several sources inside the United States, including the National Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland, the Manuscript Division at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., He's also traveled to India and consulted the National Archives of India in New Delhi. And he's gone to the Philippines as well, the Ateneo de Manila University Library in Manila. He's been to Britain. He's done research in Britain as well. The Center of South Asian Studies, University of Cambridge, the British Library in London, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, the Widner Library at Harvard, and also the special collections at the Byrd Library at Syracuse University in Syracuse, New York. He's also been to the U.S. Military History Institute in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Doe Library at the University of California, Berkeley in California, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, the Mudd Library at Princeton University, and he's also consulted microfilm at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, the William Howard Taft Papers, and he's consulted two microfilm collections, Henry Hill Bandolt's papers and Frank Murphy papers at the Bentley Library at the University of Michigan. So I imagine he's gotten quite a bit of financial resources to do this. He's traveled across the Pacific, across the Atlantic, and multiple locations in the United States. So this has probably taken him a couple of years to do the research, and he's probably gotten quite a few grants to complete this. Inside the book, he has a couple of nice maps. So here we can see a map of of India, British India, and then a map of the Philippines to just orient you. They're not anything special. They're just to orient you to sort of the locations of these colonized places. Some of the images inside the book are not all that special. I've seen many of these images in many locations across the web, particularly dealing with the American invasion of the Philippines. But some of the images are really quite incredible and are pretty interesting. And images I've never seen before and that are, I think, pretty original. So here's a couple of images dealing with the Philippines and sound. Of course, the top picture is on the cover, and then on the bottom here you can see a gramophone and people trying to figure out sort of what's going on there. I think these are nice images that encapsulate the chapter that they're in. Particularly these are in the chapter on sound, some nice pictures. So here's a picture of, let's see if I can get it here, of people in India forming a brass band. And likewise, if we flip the page, there is an image of lepers in the Philippines who are forming an orchestra. So sound can colonize, sound can heal, sound can show you the proper way, to be hygienic and clean. A couple of other images that I might flash. There's quite a few images in the book. Most of them are unique and original, and I think not really seen in published form like this before. But here we have an image of a doctor giving vaccinations to children in Calcutta. So here we can see on the British Hill Station in South India, we have this banquet of Indian food that, of course, British people who go to India are going to become, many people will fall in love with Indian food, curry. But one of the nicest pictures, I think, that encapsulates this, and it's a mundane picture. It's not anything really, if you first looked at it, you wouldn't really be anything meaningful. But after you read this book, it's very meaningful. And here is an image. This is in the conclusion of the book. We have a British man and an Indian man, and they're both wearing suits and ties, so they have the British dress, and they're having lunch. But of course, if you look closely at the table, they're eating curry or Indian food. And so we have this sort of empire of the senses in this sort of banal picture of lunch.